Well, hello everyone and good evening. It is a pleasure to welcome you to the George Washington University and tonight's event, presented in partnership with Politics and Prose bookstore. For years, GW's location in the heart of our nation's capital, our leadership in fields like history, public policy, law, and international relations, and this unique partnership with Politics and Prose have created a series of really remarkable only at GW events. Together, we have hosted conversations with former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and Chelsea Clinton, former Secretary of Defense James Mattis, author and host Rachel Maddow, and actor and GW alumna Kerry Washington. Tonight, we are honored to host an exceptional writer, thinker, and historian who is known for her reflections on leadership and leaders throughout American history, and who is often called to provide historical context for some of our nation's most critical conversations. Pulitzer Prize-winning and New York Times best-selling author and renowned presidential historian, Doris Kearns Goodwin. Joining her tonight for this conversation will be CBS's Robert Costa. I first learned about Doris Kearns Goodwin through my mother, who was a real fan of Civil War history and of Abe Lincoln. And so she introduced me to the book Team of Rivals. And that's when I first became aware of Doris Kearns Goodwin. And since then, I have so appreciated her commentary on news shows, bringing context to so many events, and personally, I have really appreciated her wisdom, her perspective, and her humor. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation tonight. To introduce our guests, I would like to welcome the co-owner of the Politics and Prose bookstore, Bradley Graham, to the stage. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. On behalf of all of us in Politics and Prose, I'd like to add my welcome to all of you and to thank Ellen and the staff here at GW for helping to make this event possible. P&P is celebrating its 40th anniversary this year. And we remain committed not only to providing the DC area with books and gift items, but also to bringing authors and readers together in forums like this. Independent bookstores are a vital part of the life of local communities and of our national culture generally. And we're very grateful for the support that all of you provide by attending events like this and by shopping with us. We're especially delighted to be hosting Doris Kearns Goodwin this evening. Her previous books on Abraham Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, the Kennedys, and Lyndon Johnson have established her as one of America's most skilled and popular historians. And once again, with her new book, An Unfinished Love Story, she's written an exceptional work, not just of history and biography, but this time also of memoir. The inspiration for this book emerged from a trove of documents and other memorabilia collected by Doris's late husband, Goodwin, who worked for John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson during their White House years and wrote speeches for Robert F. Kennedy. Doris also worked for LBJ, but after Dick did, only later in 1972, when both were at Harvard, did they meet. Dick's collection from the 1960s constitutes a unique and comprehensive archive of that period, but it had remained in storage for decades. At age 80, Dick decided with Doris to start exploring the collection, but died 6 years ago before the project was completed. Doris carried on and finished the book, which she has called the one that means the most to her, and she just learned the book has made it to the top of the bestseller list. And you all deserve credit for helping to boost it there. It is indeed a very personal story, capturing her husband's eyewitness accounts of his times with the Kennedys and Johnson in the 1960s, and reflections on that era by both him and her. It was a pivotal period, and Doris has given us a fresh, particular, and illuminating history of it. Our conversation with Doris, as Ellen mentioned, will be someone who wasn't alive in the 1960s. In fact, he wasn't born until the 1980s, Bob Costa. But Bob, of course, is an accomplished journalist and follows current politics very closely as the chief election and campaign correspondent for CBS News. He previously served as a national political reporter at the Washington Post and as moderator and managing editor of Washington Week on PBS. He also co-wrote with Bob Woodward the best-selling book Peril, about the tumultuous transition between the Trump and Biden presidencies. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Doris Kearns Goodwin and Bob Costa.
Good evening. What a joy to be here with Doris Kearns Goodwin, a living legend. Let's give her a round of applause. Top #1 New York Times best-selling author of an unfinished love story. It's just wonderful to be here. I was just with Doris in Concord, Massachusetts for CBS Sunday Morning. And if you ever have a chance to go to Concord, Massachusetts, I really encourage you to stop by the library, the collection there, all of the books, Doris and Dick's books going back decades, on display. You can look at the books Doris has used for all of her work, the books Dick had collected throughout his life. It's really a special place.
Yeah, it meant so much to me because we had 10,000 books in our house, and when I couldn't live in the house anymore because it made me too sad to think of Dick in every room and moved to a condo in Boston, I could only bring 2,500 books. So I didn't know what I was going to do with them, and the Concord Public Library offered to take them and make a special room called the Goodwin Room. I mean, this is a library that has Alcott and Thoreau and Emerson. It was so incredibly exciting. And all those books are there, and it's now become a place for civic engagement, for high school students to come, and for adult meetings at night, League of Women Voters. So it's alive all the time, and the books are, my buddies are there, keeping everybody company.
They certainly are, and it's special to be here. Thank you to GW, to Politics and Prose, and especially to Doris Kearns Goodwin. This book it's just a terrific book. I loved reading it. An unfinished love story. Well, Doris, whose love story is it?
Well, it's really two love stories. The first is to my husband. We started this book together. I was going to help him to write it. When he got cancer and died, I promised him that I would finish it. It took me a while to be able to muster the ability to do that, but it finally became a finished love story to him. But then secondly, it really is a story about the unfinished promises of America, a country that we both loved so much. And in a way, our whole history, I think, in this country is to reach out to the ideals on which we were founded, which we never can quite put into practice. Some decades we get more of it, some decades we go backwards, but it is an endless experimental movement, almost on a line of progress, backward progress, but unfinished, the story of us, which I hope will continue to go up in a positive way in the years ahead.
You've written so many first-rate books throughout your life, going back to Lyndon Johnson. I love your book about the Dodgers and growing up, of course, about President Lincoln. Yes, we have some Dodgers fans here.
There always are. It's so great. There are Dodger fans that come everywhere.
Hope that's not my dad, who's a Dodgers fan. Pipe down. But I'm just joking. You look at this book, if you haven't had a chance to read it yet, it's deeply personal. And it's about history, it's about the presidency, it's also about you, it's about Dick Goodwin, your late husband. How did you come to write this particular book?
It really began when my husband turned 80, and a few months after that, he came down the stairs one day singing "Oh, What a Beautiful Morning" from Oklahoma. He still had clumps of shaving cream on his earlobe, which wasn't unusual, and he came down and he said, "I've decided we're going to open the boxes. I knew exactly what that meant. For all the 42 years of our marriage, he had schlepped around 300 boxes of everything that he had saved from his public service in the 60s. It was a time capsule of the 60s because he was sort of a Zelig of the 60s. He was everywhere you'd want somebody to be. He was with John Kennedy in the plane during the campaign. He was in the John Kennedy White House. He was there when the Peace Corps was born. He was there at the night that his body was brought back after November 22nd, 1963. I lived with Lincoln and Dick Goodwin at the same time. He then was there at the heyday of the Great Society, worked on the great speeches, the Great Society speech and the We Shall Overcome speech, the Howard University speech. He then left Lyndon Johnson, became involved in Senator McCarthy's campaign against the war in Vietnam in New Hampshire, and then went with Bobby Kennedy, his closest friend, when he got into the race, was with Bobby when he died, and then was at that tumultuous Democratic convention. But all these years, Dick wouldn't open the boxes because the ending of the decade had been so sad, with the deaths of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy, with the riots in the streets that followed, the campus violence, that he only wanted to look ahead rather than looking backward. And I knew that there was great stuff in there, so me as an historian, I was so sad that he wasn't willing to start until finally, as I said, he comes down the stairs, he says, well, I guess it's now or never. If I have any wisdom to dispense, this is how he would talk, I better start dispensing now. So we made a pact that we would start every weekend, and we'd start from the beginning, imagining that we did not know what was coming later, not allowing us to be shadowed by that dark curtain of the deaths that took place. And that's really the way that history has to work. My heroine, Barbara Tuchman, wrote that even if you're writing about a war as a narrative historian, you have to imagine to yourself you do not know how that war ended, so you can carry your reader with you every step along the way from beginning to end, not spoiling the reader by knowing what's going to happen. So by reliving the decade of our youths, he was 12 years older than me, but the 60s was my generation too, we went back to that time and were able to experience the excitement of the early days, the thrill of certain parts of it, as well as the sadness. And then that became what I was helping him to write. And then when he died, I took it over. And as Bob said, it became partly a history, partly a biography, partly a memoir, and something that really probably mattered to me more than any other book I've ever written.
You called your Dick Goodwin a Zelig of the 60s. I mean, it's an amazing adventure he has, going from the inner circle of President John F. Kennedy to the inner circle of President Johnson, which is not an easy thing to do, then the inner circle of Robert F. Kennedy. And you see a story of a man who I didn't know enough about until I read this book. Someone who was so present in the 60s, a real leader for the country, working with presidents at the highest level. But what comes through, Doris, in your work is you have a story in the 60s. You too had a front row seat to the presidency. Tell us about your work during that time.
Well, I don't get involved in the story really until 1967, long before I'm involved in it. I think the famous moments that I think of most for him are he's on the campaign trail with John Kennedy, as I said, when the birth of the Peace Corps takes place. And it's really one of the moments I remember most clearly learning about through him. John Kennedy goes to the University of Michigan, just because he's going to be giving, there's some people here from Michigan, he's going to be giving a whistle-stop tour the next day. He gets there at 2 a.m., he's just supposed to sleep, and it turns out that 10,000 kids have been waiting for him for 4 or 5 hours. So he figures, I better say something to them. So he makes a 3-minute speech on the stairs before he goes to bed, simply saying, how many of you would be willing to go to Ghana to work and help out in developing countries? How many of you would be willing to work in healthcare, work in teaching? And the kids responded not only that night, but then they themselves took up the challenge, and they passed around a pledge that 1,000 kids would give 2 or 3 years of their life. That word of their pledge got to my husband and Ted Sorensen, who were writing a speech on foreign policy for JFK, and that's where he proposed. That's where the Peace Corps came, but it came from the ground up, which is the way change so often happens. And just one other story to tell from him, and then I promise I'll get to me. He's at the inaugural parade, and the inauguration has taken place, and it's so cold that he can't wait till the parade is over. He hates it, that nobody's wearing a coat because John Kennedy would never wear a coat, so they couldn't wear a coat. And after it's over, he decides that it's time to go in and inspect his new office in the West Wing. He's so excited. and he finds that John Kennedy is in the office inspecting his West Wing office at the same time, the Oval Office. And Kennedy looks at him and he said, did you see the Coast Guard contingent? And Dick could not remember anything about it. Kennedy said, there's not a black face among them. We must do something about it. Dick was so excited. It was his first assignment to run into the telephone upstairs, and he calls, where is the Coast Guard anyway? It turns out it's in the Treasury Department. And he called the Secretary of the Treasury, and they begin to find out that no Coast Guard Academy person, black, had graduated. So they took in their first Coast Guard black person that spring. A picture is there. His name was Merle Smith. He became an honored graduate, an honored a Bronze Star person from Vietnam, a lawyer who then taught at the Coast Guard Academy. And then I decided to follow up the story, and I found his widow, Linda Smith, and was able to talk to her about the difficulties of being a trailblazer. So that's really the way the book got constructed. There were unfinished stories as well that Dick had not been able to follow up on that I was able to follow up on. So that was one of my favorite parts of it. The only other part of the Kennedy thing that rivals that in emotion was that we were both, it turned out, at the March on Washington. I was only 20 years old, and he was already by then working in the Peace Corps. And we never quite saw each other that day. We loved to think, Dick always said he was looking for me his whole life, and we had various places where we were together, but we didn't meet. And on that day, not so surprisingly that we didn't meet, there were 250,000 other people there. And so anyway, for me, it was the most joyful day of public life I think I'd ever experienced. When I was carrying a side, Protestant Jews and Catholics unite for civil rights. There was a feeling of camaraderie. When we sung We Shall Overcome and hold hands with one another, I felt we were making America move to a better place. And once you get that feeling as a young person, you hopefully want to do something about it the rest of your life. Anyway, then what happens is I go to college, I go to graduate school, and I decide that I'm going to be a writer, but I'm going to choose the presidents that I thought had moved us forward in social justice. I could never live with a Mussolini or a Stalin or a Hitler. I wake up with them in the morning. I think about them when I go to bed at night. I got so close to my guys, as I call Lincoln and Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt and Teddy Roosevelt, and I feel like I know them. So at any rate, I'm still a graduate student at Harvard, and I get selected as a White House Fellow. And here's where I enter the story, finally. There are 16 of us that are selected. President Johnson has a big dance that night. He does dance with me. Not that peculiar. There were only 3 women out of the 16 White House Fellows. But as he twirled me around the floor, he whispered to me that he wanted me to be assigned directly to him in the White House. Well, it was not to be that simple, for in the months leading up to my selection, like many young people, I'd been active in the anti-Vietnam War movement, and a friend of mine and I had gone to a march in New York and was verging on violence. There were people burning cards, there were construction workers throwing things at the marchers in the street, and we went back and decided we would try to channel that energy into the political system. So we wrote an article arguing for a third-party candidate to challenge Lyndon Johnson. We sent it into the New Republic. We heard nothing. We were not published writers. And then I just got that White House Fellowship, and 2 days later, after the dance, it appeared in the New Republic with the title, How to Remove Lyndon Johnson in 1968. So I was certain he would kick me out of the program, but instead, surprisingly, he said, and I found out it was much more of an issue than I knew at the time. I mean, these are the kind of stories that are so troubling when they happen, but later they become a great story. The FBI did a report on me. There were daily diaries showing Johnson discussing Doris Kearns' problem with Senator Richard Russell. And finally he decided, and then they wrote, anyway, he finally decided, bring her down here for a year, and if I can't win her over, no one can. So I did end up eventually working for him in the White House, and then, as was said, accompanying him to his ranch on the last years of his life to help him on his memoirs. And mainly, I was there to listen to him. He loved to talk. He talked as you swam in the pool. He talked as you walked around the ranch. He talked as you wait for a movie to go on. He never stopped talking. And I like to believe that the reason I was there was that I was a good listener, and easy to listen to him. He was such a great, formidable, fabulous, anecdotal storyteller. But I also worried that part of I was there was because I was a young woman, so I was constantly chattering to him about steady boyfriends, even when I had no boyfriends at all. And everything was working perfectly until one day he said he wanted to discuss our relationship, which sounded ominous when he took me nearby to the lake, conveniently called Lake Lyndon Baines Johnson, and there was wine and cheese and a red check tablecloth, all the romantic trappings. And he started out, Doris, more than any other woman I have ever known, and my heart sank. And then he said, you remind me of my mother. It was pretty embarrassing given what was going on in my mind. But at any rate, then I worked in the White House. I went down to the ranch. It was an extraordinary experience. And then in the fall, he started asking me if I would come to the ranch to work on the memoirs. That's when it all began. And I really wanted to go, but I really wanted to go back to Harvard where I was going to start teaching. So I told him I'd love to come, but could I join the team? He was going to have a small team working part-time, and then I'd come on long weekends, I could spend summers. And he said, no, it's all or nothing, all or nothing. So it all looked like it wasn't going to happen. And then I was there at Christmas time, right before he was going to retire from the office in January. And he didn't get mad at me like he did with other people, bullying or yelling or screaming. What he does with other people, and he did with me, was ice me out. He'd be in a room, and he would just pretend I wasn't there, talking to everybody else but me, because he was so mad that I wasn't coming to him. And Lady Bird, of course, came to the rescue. She was always able to smooth ruffled feathers. So she came over to him, said something, I didn't hear what it was, and the next thing I know, he was talking to me with warmth as if nothing had ever happened. And then finally, still, it was unresolved until the last day of his presidency. He called me into the Oval Office as everything was getting ready for Nixon the next day, and he said, all right, part-time. So it ended up working, but he said to me, when you go back to Harvard, don't let them poison your feelings toward Lyndon Johnson. And then as he left, he said, as I was leaving rather, he said, and meanwhile, I know what it's like when you don't have as much power. I won't forget what you're doing for me. So then I did, as I say, go down there, and it set up my career. So I'll always be grateful for her and for him. And the only thing to say about Lady Bird later is she was the anchor of his life, without a question. And not too long before she died, Lucy called me up on the phone. Lady Bird had had a stroke, and she couldn't speak. And she was unable to read, which she loved reading because she had macular degenera. So she was listening to books on audio. And Lucy told me she had listened to Team of Rivals on Lincoln, and she wanted to tell me how much she liked it, and I couldn't imagine what was coming next. And Lucy said, just wait, just pause for a moment. And then I heard her clapping, and it was just an extraordinary feeling to feel connected. And then I called Lucy later to say, how do you remember that conversation? And she said, she's dramatic like her father. She said, yes, she clapped. And then greater intensity. She wanted you to know that you were a part of our family. And she was proud of you. So these are the emotional things you remember. It's such a span of things you could remember, but those are the ones I remember about him and about me.
Wonderful. I love that you stood up to President Johnson about your teaching position at Harvard. You were not going to give up that job. A lot of politicians buckled under LBJ. You held your ground. You did not meet Dick at the March on Washington. You did meet him about 10 years later in Boston. What was that like? And when you were sifting through his papers for this project, you've always said that you wish you could have known him when he was a young man. You met him when he was 42 years old. What did you learn about Dick Goodwin as a young man as you worked on this book?
Yeah, I only met him, as was said, since he was 12 years older than me. He was 42 years old. What happened is I was a young assistant professor at the time at Harvard. He came into the office building. I had a little yellow house where history and government department people were, and the Kennedys had given him an office in that house. We were creating the Kennedy School of Government, too, at that time, so he could finish a book. And we heard that Dick Goodwin was coming. We were all nerds, so we knew who he was. We knew he had worked for Kennedy and Johnson and Bobby. And I knew somebody who knew him, and they said, he's going to be a really interesting guy to be around. He's captivating. He's brash. He's arrogant. He's mercurial. He sounded really interesting to me. And I was sitting in my office, and he just sort of plopped in and sat down on one of the chairs, a 2T's chair. And he said, so, you're a graduate student, right? I said, no, I'm an assistant professor. And I labeled everything I was teaching. He said, I know. I'm just teasing you. I know you worked for Lyndon Johnson after I left. And then we started talking that afternoon about everything. He was interested in so many things, astronomy and philosophy and poetry and literature and sex and rhythm. And he was interested in the beleaguered Red Sox, who had become my team after the Dodgers had abandoned me and gone to California. At any rate, then we went to dinner that night, continued talking, and we just ended up talking for the rest of my life. I knew that I loved him that night. It took a little while for it to all work out, 3 years, but we finally did get married. And then it is true, when I went through the boxes, you think you know everything about the person you married, But as Bob said, I always wanted to know what he was like as a young man. I always feel envious of people who marry their college sweethearts or their high school sweethearts. They have all those memories to share. So I would constantly ask him, what were you like when you were a young man? Would I have fallen in love with you? And he said, how do I know what I was like? I was too busy being him to know what I was being. And so I was able, however, to find out, because he had written 50 letters to his best friend George, who later became a novelist from college, and that George gave the letters back to Dick, and so we read them together. And they really showed me the person that he was. And he also wrote 100 letters and postcards to his parents, which his mother had kept. So when I was sifting all through this, I think there were two things I found out that really surprised me. The first was that he was really happy when he was young. He talks about greeting every day with a cheerful smile. He talks about, just eureka, whoopee, excitement, everything's good. And I knew good things had happened to him. He was first in his class at Harvard Law Review. He was president of the Law Review. He clerked for Justice Frankfurter. But the person that I knew had a layer of melancholy. He was joyful and vital, but there was a sadness throughout his life, and I think it had to do with things happened to people, but I hadn't been aware that he hadn't started that way. I mean, his first wife had died. Obviously, John Kennedy was assassinated. Bobby was with him when he died. He was with Bobby when he died. His dreams of having stayed in public life, which he would have with Bobby, were undone, and he never really was back in public life after that again. But I said to him one morning when I came down, I said, I really am smitten with this guy. I would have loved you then. He said, well, I'm glad you like him so much. And I said, well, what do you mean? It is you. He said, no, it isn't really. I mean, it's not just because I'm much, much older now. I lost something along the way. And one of the things that happened in working on the project with him was that and I'll talk about this more as we get along, but it had a soothing effect on him to reconnect with those memories. And so many of them were positive, and things were different than he had remembered them in his mind. And I think at the end of his life, he came to a sense of fulfillment about what he had done with Lyndon Johnson, with whom he was so angry for a period of time. And anyway, that's one of the things that mattered to me, was just to see him when he was younger. The other was we came upon these letters to him, letters to George, where he's saying it was his third year now in law school. He was being courted by law firms all around the country. He said, it's a real burden of choice. Where should I go? I could do this, or I could take a scholarship, or I could clerk for a justice. I'm not sure what to do. And right after that, I found a picture in his papers of the Law Review, a group of them, 60 guys and 2 women. One was Ruth Bader Ginsburg. The other was a woman named Nancy Boxley. So I came running in with the picture. I said, she couldn't even get an interview for a job, and you're worried about the burden of choice that you have? He said, well, it wasn't my fault. It wasn't my fault. But interestingly then, as we know, all those doors were closed to Ruth Bader Ginsburg when she finished law school, but she opened doors for women the rest of her life and became a Supreme Court justice. So then I decided to interview the other woman whose picture was there, a stately woman in her late 80s, Nancy Boxley, who lived in California. And she told me that she actually did get a job at first, mainly because she didn't have a child, which Ruth did at the beginning. But when she got pregnant, the law firm let her go. But then she eventually got a job back in the law firms. But she went to her 30th reunion at Harvard, and she said her professor that she went to watch was wearing short dress, wearing boots, and was pregnant. So progress was made.
In the book, it's so evident that Dick Goodwin was a star early on, a star law student. If you haven't seen the Robert Redford film Quiz Show, I highly encourage you to watch it as you read this book. Dick Goodwin, a main character in that film, about his work as an investigator in the 1950s of these rigged quiz shows. It's crazy to think that was happening back then, but it did, and Dick found out about it and did something about it. But the book has this turning point where he goes from being this star to being a star that's aligned with John F. Kennedy. Tell us about how he came to be someone who was a true Kennedy man, a Kennedy confidant.
Yeah, so what happened is he was clerking for Justice Frankfurter in Washington, and Kennedy sort of had kept a tap probably on bright young people running around Washington, and he got a request one day from Ted Sorensen, Kennedy's chief speechwriter, would he try a draft for a speech? So while he was actually interviewing contestants for the quiz show scandal, he wrote a draft for a speech, and then he was asked to write another draft. He was told the Kennedy style, what it would mean for a speech, and he did a third one, and he actually got the job as the second speechwriter. He never knew at the time that it was actually a contest, that 30 other people had been asked to do the same thing, some of whom were published writers. So it meant that he went on the plane, as I said, with John Kennedy, and there was just an intimacy about that plane. He crisscrossed the country for the entire campaign. There was chairs that John Kennedy had his own apartment in the back of the plane. Ted Sorensen and Dick had these little chairs that became beds, and they were together 24 hours a day. So that there was a loyalty, I think, that sprung up between that. Some of it is romantic, maybe looking back on those Kennedy people, and I'm sure there were plenty of disagreements among the staff as well, but there was something about the small team then, so much less than what you know from campaigns now. And the fact that they were on this prop plane together and they'd land down and come back on the plane. I mean, there's a moment when after the debate, the first debate with Richard Nixon, where Dick was so excited as a young man, he was certain after that debate that Nixon had lost and that Kennedy had won. They get back on the plane and Kennedy's sitting together there. Kennedy's having his favorite comfort food afterwards, which was tomato soup and beer, an unusual combination. And they're analyzing what he could have done better. This was a great thing about JFK, Dick told me, that he was always looking at how he could improve. He was such a fast speaker at first that people couldn't sink in what he was saying. But he would ask the reporters afterward, tell me, where did I lose them? Where am I doing well? What can I do better? So similarly that night, it was very analytical. And Dick thought, why aren't they celebrating? We should be celebrating. And he burst out and he said, we've got it. We're going to beat him. We're going to beat him. And Kennedy just looked at him and said, we have a long way to go. Kennedy knew that he was a veteran sailor. He knew what it was. But just imagine picturing him. He and Sorensen had worked for days preparing him for that speech. Dick couldn't sleep the night before. Kennedy took a nap. He was relaxed. And as we know, Nixon had more difficulties that day, had spent it alone, whereas Kennedy is napping, talking with his friends, and goes out there and maybe doesn't beat him in verbal things, but the television was the first political celebrity. Dick said after that night, they would go out and the crowds had quadrupled. People are screaming. There was something about seeing somebody it was where celebrities are born, on television, and that political celebrity was born that night.
If you haven't read it yet, this book is really special because you get these mini portraits of the presidents, like especially JFK and LBJ, in the book from Doris Kearns Goodwin, even as you're reading about this story, this epic love story throughout the 1960s and beyond. And it's so great to also learn in the book about Dick's relationship with the First Lady, Jackie Kennedy. It comes through in the book. Dick was so connected to the magic, the idea of Camelot, a special place. And he also ended up working for Lyndon Johnson, and this is so fascinating in the book. Johnson, as we all know, the Kennedy and Johnson camps did not get along well. But Johnson, smart. He saw in Dick Goodwin real talent. Tell us about what you heard on some of the tapes from LBJ.
Yeah, we listened to some of the LBJ tapes. You know, LBJ had a button that he could press on his Oval Office, and if he thought he was having an important conversation, that they would be recorded. Nobody knew they were being recorded at the time, but he needed that if he was making a deal with a congressman or a senator to remind them what the deal was that was made. So in this case, but he also taped other things at the same time. You know, it's so funny. I'll just make a wide-ranging thing. I was hearing today that something came up about. Let me tell you the story first. After I was finished with the work on the branch with Johnson, I met a man named Don Kendall. This has to do with the LBJ tapes. I like to go inside. This is why it takes so long to write these books. These side journeys come. I think you'll come with me on this one. So anyway, Don Kendall was the president of CEO of Coca-Cola. And he said, I know you knew Lyndon Johnson when you were a young girl, but I have a Lyndon Johnson story I bet you don't know. And he said when Nixon first became president, he asked Don Kendall to go to the ranch to look at talk to Johnson about some sensitive matter. And he said, Johnson's working on his memoir. He looks up grumpily. How am I supposed to remember what happened 20 years ago, 30 years ago? The only chapters are any good at all. I had this tape machine in my Oval Office. I pressed a button and I can have verbatim conversation, and those chapters are coming out well. So you go back and tell your good friend Nixon as he starts his presidency, nothing more important than a taping system. So anyway, The way we learned that Dick got to work for Lyndon Johnson is the tape with Johnson talking to Moyers in March of 1964. And he says to him, I need somebody who can work on my speeches. They have to put sex in my speeches. I want them to put rhythm in my speeches. I want them to have great Churchillian phrases in my speeches. Who can that be? And Moyers, knowing Dick from the Peace Corps, knowing him from working on the White House with JFK, said, well, the only person I know who can do that is Goodwin, but he's not one of us. That was what you're saying. There was already a fault line between the Kennedys and the Johnsons, but Johnson did bring him over, and he became his chief speechwriter. So that was the moment when it began, and not long after that begins the Great Society and the beginning of that.
Let's dig into the Great Society. At one point, it was 2 words, Great Society, but then it became the Great Society, capital G, capital S. What was Dick's role in cultivating that idea, building that theme with President Johnson?
It really all began about a month or so after he got to the White House, so it was in April of 1964. And one day, Moyers says to him, the president wants us to come and talk to him about his vision for a Johnson program. He was already getting some of Kennedy's programs through. The Civil Rights Bill was going through the Congress and the Senate. He'd gotten the tax cut bill through, and now he wanted a Johnson vision. So Dick said, are we meeting him in the Oval Office? He said, no, we're going to the White House pool. So they get to the pool. Johnson is naked, swimming in the pool. He's going up and down, side-stroking, and the 2 of them are standing there in their suits and ties. He says, come on in, boys, come on in. So they strip on the spot, and then you see 3 naked guys swimming in this pool, up and down the pool. Finally, they pull over to the side, and Johnson starts talking about what he wants to be the Johnson program. And already outlined in his mind was that he wanted Medicare and Medicaid and aid to education and civil rights and voting rights and immigration reform and aid to the cities and pollution control. All of it was already in his head. And he said, okay, so now we have to put this into a program. They had already had some task forces to come on each one of these issues. And they put a deadline for the speech at the University of Michigan on May 22nd. That's how a speech can make you come up with what the programs were. So then they didn't know what to call this thing. So I said, well, how did you come up with the name? Well, then I remember Dick said to me, well, it's not like naming some massive infant baby. You just have to try it out. So they tried out in a couple speeches, the Great Society, just in non-capital letters, the Great Society. And then he tried it in another, and the press caught on to it. Somebody else was arguing for a better deal rather than a new deal, someone else for the Glorious Society. But anyway, it became the Great Society, and it was outlined in that speech in May of 64. And really what it talked about was the affluence of the country had to be somehow shared by more people who would have a chance to rise. Dick always loved what Lincoln said, that the point of a democracy was that each person could rise to the level of their talent and discipline. You can't give them more talent than they have. You can't make them work harder than they do. Whatever they do, though, they should be able to rise to that. And you shouldn't have structural impediments along the way. And the Great Society, by dealing with health and education and welfare, was going to help to make that possible. In a time of affluence, there was a feeling in the country as a whole that we had a responsibility for poverty, a responsibility for injustice, and that was the great mark of that period of the Great Society. I think he'll be forever proud for having been part of it, and the country is finally recognizing much more than it did before. It's all around us. Those programs are still there, and they've made a huge difference in the lives of many of us.
And speaking of, it's a great message. And Dick, so clearly as you do, understood the power of words, and it wasn't just the Great Society. You almost get a chill still when you watch it. We shall overcome. Helping President Johnson get to that moment rhetorically and own it. Tell us about that.
Well, the story is an interesting story of what happened is after Bloody Sunday took place in Selma, Alabama, when the peaceful marchers led by John Lewis and Hosea Williams were on the bridge and met by the Alabama State Troopers, and the troopers rushed into the crowd of peaceful marchers with their whips and billy clubs, horses trampling over them, all of which was caught on television. It fired the conscience of the country, and Johnson realized that. He wasn't planning to have voting rights that year. He thought we needed 64 to absorb the Civil Rights Act, and then voting rights that would come the next year. But he knew that it was time to do it, that you had to move at that moment. So a week after Bloody Sunday, he decided to give a speech to a joint session of Congress calling for voting rights. And he decided to do it on a Sunday night, and it was going to be Monday night. And Dick was not in the White House that night. He was at Arthur Schlesinger's house, the historian, eating and drinking and merrily having a good time. And the next morning when he went into work, he wasn't working on the speech. And Johnson came down and said, "How is Dick Goodwin doing on the speech?" And Jack Valenti, who'd been there the night before, one of his aides, said, "Well, I gave it to this other speechwriter who was there that night." And Johnson exploded, "Only Dick Goodwin can do this speech." And so get him to work on it. So we had only from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. to work on that speech. I asked him how he did it. I couldn't have done that. I know I could. History is more patient. I have more time to write my books. I don't have to have the deadlines. You might be able to as a journalist. You're used to deadlines. He put his watch in the drawer so he wouldn't know the time was passing. And then he had to have complete serenity. Nobody could bother him. His secretary would bring out the pages little at a time, and then they go to the president for editing and come back to him. So he kept working and kept working, and then finally, in the middle of the day, he took a walk to smoke his cigar and get out, and he heard in the distance, people singing, "We Shall Overcome." He came back in, continued to work on the speech. The only time that Lyndon Johnson bothered him was he called him near the end of that time and said, "I'd like to talk about Cthulhu." Dick said it was the softest speech, tone in his speech that he'd ever heard. And he said, and Dick knew exactly what they meant. In those days, the speechwriters lived in the West Wing. They went to the ranch. They knew Johnson's convictions. They knew what Cthulhu was. It was a small Mexican-American school that Johnson had gone to teach to. In the middle of his college degree, he had to work for a year. And it was a very poor community, Cthulhu. And he saw the pain of those kids' faces when they came to school without anything to eat, when they knew people disliked them, but they didn't know why. And he told Dick, "I want to deal with that somehow in the speech." So here comes the speech. I mean, it's just, he always loved a first line that would catch the audience. And it started out, "I speak tonight for the dignity of man and the destiny of democracy." And then he goes on to say about voting rights, that this is not a northern problem, not a southern problem, not a states' right problem, not a national problem. It is a human problem, and it is a problem we as Democrats and Republicans are here to meet tonight together. It's not a constitutional problem. The command of the Constitution is clear. It is not a moral problem. It is simply wrong to deny your fellow Americans the right to vote. And then he said, but even if we do this, the just blessings of American society will need to be worked on to be able to be fairly distributed. But if we do that, we shall overcome, which meant that the President of the United States was taking and connecting himself to the anthem of the civil rights movement. And together, that's when change takes place in our country, when the outside movement can pressure the inside and fire the conscience of the people, and then social change takes place. The audience erupted with that, but then he comes up to Cthulhu. And what Johnson said was, in 1928, when I was young, I stood there and I so wanted to help those kids, but I couldn't do much. I gave part of my salary for soccer and baseball equipment, but that was all I could do. But now I'm standing here in 1965, and those kids have kids and grandkids, and I can do something for them. I have the power, and I intend to use it. It was great. And 5 months later, the Voting Rights Act passed. Dick was one of the people who got one of the pens that Lyndon Johnson had signed the Voting Rights Act with, which proudly hung on our wall for all the years of our life. So I think that moment was probably for Dick the most fulfilling moment. I was listening to that speech, and I never could I have imagined, as I listened to that speech with my friends, that I would be working for the man who delivered it 3 years later, or that I would meet and marry the man who had helped to craft those words so many years later. So this was those moments when you feel like fate and history are coming together. But Dick later said that never could he have imagined that night, as he stood in the well of the House, so proud of the president, so proud of the country, that in 2 years' time he would be out in the streets marching against Lyndon Johnson because of the war in Vietnam.
We're going to go to questions in a moment. If you would like to ask Doris a question, there are microphones in the back of the room, I believe. If you want to start lining up while she answers this question, that would be wonderful. And we will then take your questions for Doris. Doris, before we get to the Q&A, any lessons you can share from the 60s for us today as we look ahead to the turbulence we're all witnessing in our own times, the upcoming election, what can the experience of Dick Goodwin, your own experience from the 1960s, tell us about how to deal with today and to be our best selves?
Well, I think what I'd like young people to know if they look back at the 1960s is that it was a time when young people really were powered by the conviction that they could make a difference. And they joined by the thousands the Peace Corps. Young people were marching and freedom rides and sit-ins, marching against segregation, marching against the denial of the vote. This was a time with the launch of the women's movement, the gay rights movement for freedom and equality. It was a time when you do feel larger, when you feel like, as I say, that feeling I felt first in the March on Washington. And I just wish that young people, many of them are frustrated today. They're not engaged in some ways. Many of them are, but there's a feeling that there's not much they can do, that things are out of their control. And it's been a hard time these last years for young people with COVID, with what's going on with the polarization, with a president who hadn't accepted the transfer of power on January 6th and all that happened with that. But if only they can remember that it is in their control. Chapters of history have to be written by ourselves. And that's one of the lessons that I think I take away from the 60s. That's where the energy came from. And the other one is really just the experience of going through those boxes. Somehow, we wait too long, I think, to look at our loved ones' scrapbooks or memories that might be in an attic, and you have to go through it after they die. And I just urge people, when they have people who are older, to try and start talking to them about their memories. For Dick, it gave him a sense of purpose in those last years. We really had a feeling that so long as we had more boxes to go through, that somehow, I remember he said once, who's going to win, the boxes or me, once he got the cancer? Which one's going to be finished first? But he looked forward to it every day, and he really came in those last years when we talked about it to remember the heyday of Lyndon Johnson. He had kept that resentment toward him because of the war for so long that it had really poisoned his memories of it. But just reliving 1964 and 1965, I remember one night when we just finished going through 65 in the 89th Congress, and he went upstairs and we talked for hours that night. He said, oh my God, I'm feeling affection for the old guy again. And it meant that there was a healing, as I said earlier, or hinted at earlier. And when he went to his death in those last weeks, he really felt a sense that he had done something, that it had mattered what he did, and that people would remember that, and more importantly, the country would remember what happened during that period when he was lucky enough to be a public servant. So I just hope that people understanding this whole process, whether you're going to be written on Mount Rushmore or you're going to be written about in stories or movies, all of us want to be remembered somehow after we die. And maybe it's the way you tell a story to your children or your grandchildren, and then they tell the story to their people and their families and their colleagues. And that the more you can talk about those stories with the people that you love, then they live on forever in the memories of others. And I think that's the biggest lesson I'd like people to take away from it.
Excellent advice. Let's go to the audience.
I have read you since I was in high school, and I've been a huge fan, and I've read all of your books. And a few years ago, and I can't wait to read this one, but a few years ago I was in a used bookstore, and I found, without a cover, a red book titled Remembering America. And when I was near the end of it, I finally realized who Richard Goodwin was by association with you. And I loved that book. It's a fantastic book. And anytime I can promote that book, I tell everyone it's like the Forrest Gump of the 1960s. I mean, he was everywhere, like the quiz show movie. I mean, it's such a good book. And I'm wondering if you've ever considered reissuing it, or after, this is off the New York Times bestseller list, if that would come back, because you're talking about his work. And it just comes through in that book. So I'm just curious to know if that has another life in it.
I'm not sure I understood the question.
She's wondering if Dick's book,
Remembering
America, will ever be reissued.
Yeah.
Possibly so now. I mean, he didn't have access to these boxes when he was writing that book. I mean, he had taken some things out before he put the boxes away. But it's a wonderful book, and I would like other people to read it as well. I'm so glad you did that. That was his first stab at history, and then this one became the deeper version that he could write. Thank you for knowing that.
Thank you.
Good evening. This question is about President Johnson. I think I recently read that he once called the filibuster the fountainhead of democracy. Given the polarization of our times that you just referenced, what do you think he would take as far as giving advice to today's generation about how we could try to break the gridlock? Do you think he'd stand by institutions like the filibuster?
Yeah, the filibuster was, of course, the real obstacle for all those years to passing any civil rights legislation before 1964. And Johnson was only able to get that filibuster broken by endless work with Republicans. I mean, that's one of the things that, when I look back at this era in time, once he knew that he was going to try and get that civil rights bill through, he knew that it was going to be hard to get through the Congress, but he did do that in the House. But he knew that the only way he could get it through in the Congress, in the Senate, was to have 22 Republicans to join the 44 Northern Democrats. And when you read the tapes again to see how he did it, it was an act of brilliance. Every single senator and congressman he would call them at 6 in the morning, he would call them at noon, he would call them at midnight. He even called a senator at 2 a.m. and he said, "I hope I didn't wake you up." And the senator said, "No, I was just lying here looking at the ceiling, hoping my president would call." And he made deals with all of them. He finally got to Everett Dirksen, who was the leader of the minority leader of the Republicans. And what do you want, Dirksen? Anything you want. You want a public works project, you want a dam, you want me to come to Peoria, Springfield, whatever. But he finally realized that Dirksen cared about how he'd be remembered too. So he says to him, "Everett, you come with me on this bill and you bring your Republicans. 200 years from now, school children will know only two names, Abraham Lincoln and Everett Dirksen." But nonetheless, it takes that kind of effort, and it took the civil rights movement to be bringing that pressure to break that filibuster. I think we need structural changes in our country, and I think the filibuster rule has to be thought through. It's crazy that the minority have the power that they do. I know the importance of the individual states having so much power, and they like their 2 senators to have that extra power. But after a while, what we've seen in the last years is minority control of majority. There are majority opinions on gun safety. There's majority opinions on climate change right now. There's a majority opinion on the right to choice. And it's being strangled by some parts of the political system. I think the Electoral College needs to be thought through. Dick definitely wrote a political manifesto about the need for a new political revolution, and I know how complicated it all is, but I think all these things should be studied. If it takes that kind of energy that it took to get it through in '64, and that's the only filibuster that we've easily been able to break in this period of time, we can't afford to have that happen on such important issues as civil rights or voting rights.
Doris, I'd like to ask about your family. When you married Richard, he had already had a 9-year-old, he had a son, 9 years old. You invited Jacob Marlin and Johnny Temple, Jacob is my son, to come to the wedding.
Yes, indeed. Oh my God, go ahead.
And but you had, with Richard, you had 2 other sons. And would you tell us about your family?
I'd be very happy to. Thank you so much. Yes, Dick's son was 10 years old when we got married. He went to Georgetown Day School here in Washington because Dick was the political editor of the Rolling Stone. And so I came down to be with him. I was still teaching at that time. And he had friends, not only Johnny Temple, but Andy Blankstein, who married Beth Lasky, who I've worked with for the last 22 years. So I've known Andy since he was 8 years old. We had 2 other boys right away, 15 months apart from each other, Irish twins. So all of a sudden I had 3 kids. And I remember once being at Harvard Square, and I wasn't teaching, I was just simply writing, and it took me forever to write the second book because of this. And I heard somebody say, "Whatever happened to Doris Kearns anyway? Did she die?" And I wanted to say, I had 3 boys, that's what happened to me. And it meant that there was a slow pace of work during those years. It took me, I used to go to the Concord Public Library in order to work, to get away, and had a babysitter in the house when the kids were there, because it was too hard to tell them, "Don't come in my study, I'm working." And Dick was able to call the library whenever he needed time for me to come home for lunch, because he was working at home. But it meant a pace that was slower than it might have been, but I'll never regret having spent that time when the kids were little. And then as they got older, I could go more hours, I could work more. Life is longer. I'm 81 years old now, and I'm still running running around, and it feels so good. But the most important thing is I think about what those kids have become. Richard works in California. He's the only one in our family who's a technological genius, and he works in a software company. My son, Michael, was a teacher for 20 years who won an award as one of the best teachers in New York State, no, in the country, rather, and is now working in publishing and has a band. And then my youngest son, Joey, majored in history and literature at Harvard, and 2001 he graduated, and right after 9/11 joined the Army. And so he became a platoon leader in Baghdad and then Iraq, and then was called back to Afghanistan. Eventually went to law school and ended up working for the CEO of the Bank of America on environmental sustainability. But he said that he would look back on those days when he was in the Army as his proudest time, because he was able, as a platoon leader, to bring together people from all classes and sections and parties and religions of the country together on a common mission. That's what the Army does. Sometimes I think if I could do one thing, it would be to have a national service program so that kids from high school could go for a year from the city to the country or the north to the south, and they could somehow learn how to come together across those party lines, across those section lines. I mean, Teddy Roosevelt warned that the greatest peril to democracy would be if people in different sections, regions, and parties began regarding each other as the other rather than as common American citizens. And that's where we're at right now. We've got to figure out a way to do that. David McCullough's grandson, the historian's grandson, is working on a version of this, an American exchange program, where kids go from 1 week from one part of the country to another, and then the reverse comes back there, like from Wellesley to Cotulla, or the north to the south, and they work on a common mission as well. And I just really think we've got to figure out ways for that younger generation to get out of the silos and feel themselves commonly involved in problems of this country of ours.
We have time for one more question.
Good evening, Mrs. Goodwin. My name is Ryan Lee, and I'm a high school history teacher.
Yay!
Yes. Thank you. I must refer to you at least, let's say, 10, 15 times over the course of every semester when I teach U.S. history. And much like you, I'm a very proud nerd. And I'm curious to know, I always look to grow as a teacher. I look to grow in everything that I do. And I'm curious, is there any piece of advice that you have for me to be a better history teacher? And I also have one more question. I came to see you 6 years ago here in DC, and I took a picture with you, and I brought it with me, and I wanted to know if you would sign it so I could hang it in my classroom to show my students, because I mention you all the time.
I would be glad to.
Thank you.
No, I think that, I mean, it's so important right now that history be taught to the younger generation. It's heartbreaking to me to know that in high schools and colleges, the number of classes are diminishing, the number of history teachers in colleges are diminishing, at a time when history itself is at peril, when people don't want us to be teaching troubling parts of history because it'll make people feel bad, when in fact, out of those troubling parts, as we saw with Selma, as we saw in Birmingham, Alabama, come the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. So much, or out of the Civil War and all the horrors of slavery, come emancipation. And we're having at a time now where books are being banned, which shouldn't be read. These are the things we really have to fight. And I so value that you're teaching history. I think the best way to teach history is storytelling. There's something about stories that are hardwired in our brain. And I think history is about stories. They're about people who lived before us, about their troubles and their conflicts. So many kids will say, oh, it's just about facts. Facts are important because chronology matters. It matters what happened here and there. But what really matters is teaching them about other people who lived in another time and who had the same dreams as we had, or the same hopes that we had, or some were smashed and some were allowed to happen. Everybody should love history. I mean, I don't know why they don't. It's crazy. I had a history teacher in high school. You learn from these people, and the history teacher in high school was so good that she won an award as the best teacher in New York State. She made us feel she really knew the people she was talking about. When Lincoln died, she started telling us, and she started crying, and I thought, she must know him. She's crying. But maybe I'll just end by saying I think my real love of history began when my father taught me that mysterious art of keeping score while listening to baseball games, so that I could record for him the history of that afternoon's Brooklyn Dodger game. When he came home from work with all my miniaturized symbols, I could tell him this happened, this play happened. And I think I learned the narrative art because he would listen to me for such a long period of time. It seemed magic about history to keep a beloved father's attention. And but at first I would not know how to tell a story, so I would start blurting out, the Dodgers won or the Dodgers lost, before I told him the play-by-play, inning by inning. So the whole thing was ruined. So I finally learned you had to tell a story from beginning to middle to end. But in some ways, I guess I've passed that love of baseball from my father onto my kids, though, as I said, when the Dodgers abandoned us, I couldn't even follow baseball until I went to Harvard and then became an irrational Red Sox fan. And we had season tickets for 30 years before my husband died. And I would bring my kids to those games, and they too loved baseball. And there were times when I could just close my eyes and imagine myself a young girl once more in the presence of my father, watching the players of my youth on the grassy fields below. This is how history gets you wonderfully in different layers of time. And I could imagine Pee Wee Reese and Duke Snider and Jackie Robinson on the field. And then you open your eyes, and there's my son sitting in the place where my father once sat. And they'd never seen my father because he had died long before I was married, before I was born. But they know him through all the stories I have told, which comes back in the end to that question of why I love history so much, because it does allow you not only to bring presidents who are not longer alive back to life, but to bring the people you love back to life through the stories you tell. So history is storytelling, and if kids got that, they'd love it for the rest of their life.
The book is an unfinished love story. And it, just as one of your readers, I know speaking on behalf of so many here, your readers' appreciation for you, your dedication to history, to this country, to excellence, year after year, your love of this country, your love of writing, sharing the stories of leadership. We all have an unfinished love story with you and your work. So Doris Kearns Goodwin, thank you very much, and congratulations.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you very much.